Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
From 1915 to 1970, 6 million African Americans streamed out of the American South for parts north and west, and the Great Migration, as it's known, would change the face of the United States forever. My guest today spent 15 years researching the stories of that era, a conversation with Isabel Wilkerson about her best-selling book, The Warmth of Other Suns. That's next on Dialogue. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. When you're a writer, sometimes you can be working on one story only to realize it's about something larger. Such was the case for my guest today. In the 1990s, Isabel Wilkerson was the Chicago bureau chief for the New York Times, covering stories all over the Midwest. Her reporting would garner her a Pulitzer Prize, making Wilkerson the first black woman to win the award. As she spoke with her African American interviewees, Wilkerson noticed a pattern. Many had emigrated from the South. They were part of what is known as the Great Migration. From World War I to around 1970, an estimated 6 million African Americans left the South. Wilkerson wanted to know more. After 1,200 interviews and 15 years of research, the result was a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, published in 2010. Since then, Wilkerson has been on her own journey, traveling the world talking about her book and the effects of the Great Migration. I caught up with her in Idaho Falls, where she was the keynote speaker for the Idaho Humanities Council's annual lecture there in 2014. Welcome to Idaho. It's so nice to have you here.
Oh, great to be here.
We're going to talk a little bit about the path that you took to write this book, but I really want to start by asking you about the journey that has happened since it's been published. You're still on the road, nearly 4 years after the book came out.
Yeah, I had no way to even imagine the journey that this book would take me on. I had no idea that it would take me all over the country. I've been from Maine to Alaska, and I've been outside of the country from Amsterdam in the Netherlands to Singapore, literally. Just got back from the UK. People all over the world actually can identify with the story within this book, because almost all of us are descended from somebody who had to have come from a long way away. And many of the places outside of this country, people really recognize a lot of the people that came out of this migration, a lot of famous people who ended up in some ways reshaping parts of our culture as we know it. People like Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate, and Motown itself, which wouldn't have existed without the Great Migration, and people as distinct as John Coltrane to August Wilson, the playwright, to Lorraine Hansberry, and it goes on and on and on of all these people. And they're beloved all over the world, and so when they make this connection that these people wouldn't have existed had they or their ancestors or their parents not fled the southern part of our country during much of the 20th century, these people wouldn't have existed. And so it sort of all comes full circle no matter where I am.
So what's that been like for you?
Well, it's just been so tremendously rewarding. I mean, I spent 15 years on this book. I mean, this is my
your
copy.
Tattered copy
yeah,
is with you.
this is my tour copy, and it looks like it is 15 years old. But I spent 15 years on it, and during those long years of interviewing people, of auditioning people to be in this book, to be the protagonist for this book, of going through the archives, of hearing their stories, of even being in the hospital when they got sick. I mean, so many things I went through. I just could not have imagined that when I came out of the light into the light of after that tunnel of being in the midst of all of this, I could never have imagined the reception that it got.
You really see this as almost an immigrant experience, because their lives changed so drastically and they left everything behind.
Yeah, I really do see it as a kind of unspoken, unnamed immigration. These people were immigrants within the borders of their own country. So they were leaving a place that literally was a different country. The rules and the laws were literally different. There were things that they couldn't do that they could do outside of the South. And so merely by leaving, they actually could live out their lives as the American citizens that they had been born to begin with. In other words, this is the only group of people that had to leave their home region just to be able to be citizens. In other words, they had to act like immigrants in order to become citizens in their own country.
Well, let's talk about some of those laws.
Yeah.
Well, I should back up and say that a lot of the impetus for the migration was economic, particularly beginning with World War I. More jobs were available, so people wanted to go towards that light, towards that sun, going back to your title. But another impetus was just the shocking condition in which people were having to live.
Yeah.
Not only, I mean, lynchings that you mention in your book and burnings, just really tough things to read about, but bizarre, arcane, and cruel laws.
Yes, absolutely.
And we've all grown up hearing about some of them and knowing people who lived under them, stepping into the gutter to let a white person pass, separate drinking fountains, separate restrooms. But in your book, you purposely talk about some other Jim Crow laws, as they're known.
Yeah, I didn't really want to spend too much time on the things we knew already, like the restrooms and the water fountains. I mean, everybody learns that. The second graders are learning that. In February, they learn that. I wanted to focus in on the things that would give a sense of what it was like to live in that suffocating, all-encompassing caste system that was beyond just the laws. It was beyond just any rules that could be written down. It had to do with what one's place was in that world. And there were reminders at every turn, from the moment you woke up until the moment that you went to sleep, on all sides of that caste system. In other words, blacks and whites were under pressure to live in separate worlds. And there was a dividing line that neither of them could cross. And so, for example, it was against the law in Birmingham for a black person and a white person to merely play checkers together. It was against the law. You could go to jail, 1 year imprisonment in Alabama if you were caught playing checkers with a person of a different race. And there were separate Bibles in courtrooms throughout the South to swear to tell the truth on. There were separate staircases, separate elevators. There were separate bar stools in a bar. So a black stool and then a white stool. There were separate parking spaces, separate telephone booths. So every single thing that could be imagined to be separate was
I was astonished that you couldn't, when you were driving, no matter how slow the person in front of you was going, how slowly, if that individual were white, you could not pass them.
You could not. An African American could not pass another motorist on the road if they were white, because that was the rule that was set up as just a reminder that at every turn you were to stay in your place within that caste system. So that the economics and the caste structure in which they were living were, twin forces that would have been making it a suffocating and limiting and dispiriting and nerve-jangling way to live. And of course, there was the ever-present violence to enforce this caste system to such a degree that every 4 days in the early decades of the 20th century, an African American lost his or her life in a public execution, which was the lynchings. The lynchings, there was one every 4 days, which would have been a reminder of the strict and immutable barriers that one could not cross in that world.
So beginning around World War I, when the jobs opened, people started leaving. And
well, it actually started with you're absolutely right. The interesting thing about that is that the earliest arrivals were actually recruited. I think that it puts a different spin when you think about it on how people arrived in these large numbers. The North actually sent recruiters to bring them to the North to fill in for the lost labor force that the North no longer had access to because Europe was at war and immigration had come to a virtual halt. And that meant that the North needed labor, and they began to recruit the first arrivals. So that's how the doors opened up for them. The people had always wanted to go, and they would have taken any opportunity to go, but they didn't really have that sense of being able to make a go of it without the recruitment that began.
You wanted to tell the story through individuals, which as journalists we often do, because that's the way to not simplify it, but make it easier for people to understand and identify with.
Yeah.
And so you, as you mentioned earlier, literally kind of auditioned people.
Yeah.
You spent years going to clubs, southern clubs that were in northern cities,
Yeah.
AARP meetings, union meetings, and you narrowed it down to 3 individuals. And I encourage people to read the book to learn more. We can't go into detail
Yeah.
about the 3, but Ida Mae Gladney,
George
Starling, and Dr. Bob
Foster.
Dr. Bob Pershing Foster, yes. And he was quite a character. I mean, what did he say? I'm my favorite
He
person.
said, I love to talk, and I'm my favorite subject.
I mean, you can't get much better when you're a journalist, somebody who wants to talk. But tell us, I know you were looking for people who came in each era, 30s, 40s, 50s. You were looking for individuals who represented the different pathways, the main routes that people took to the New York area, to the Midwest, Chicago, and to California.
To the West.
To the West. But there was something more than that. There had to be something else, that spark.
Yeah.
So what were you looking for with your individuals?
I needed balance because they were very strong. They were strong characters, and they needed to be able to stand up to one another on the page. And I also needed people who were ready to talk. I mean, a lot of people, I interviewed so many people, 1,200 people. I auditioned for the role of being a protagonist in this book. And I heard many, many stories, and some people were willing to talk about certain aspects of it. And I needed to be able to have people who were willing to really go deep into their own experiences. This had been so traumatic for people that a lot of them were experiencing a kind of post-traumatic stress and were reluctant to talk about it. This is something that people didn't generally talk about at all, to such a degree that the children of this migration often didn't know very much about what their parents or grandparents had endured. And so they had to have come to terms with it somehow within themselves. And I fortunately ran into quite a few people who had done that. Then after I had that pool of people, I then needed to narrow it down, and it got to be kind of tough. There were about 30 people, any one of whom could have been the 3. And then I needed to balance them out. So, I needed socioeconomic diversity. So there's a sharecropper's wife, there's a railroad man, and then there's a physician. And that gives you a sense of the variety of people who were part of this thing. But then beyond all of that, I needed people who were just characters who had a sense of humor, who had a sense of wisdom, and were really thoughtful about what they'd gone through. And these people they had a tremendous sense of all that they'd gone through and all of the pain and the tragedies that they had endured. They still had a sense of laughter about them. And I thought that if I felt a connection to them, and if I found them to be sort of rich and wonderful storytellers, full of life, then other people would too. One of the things that you look for in this kind of work, narrative nonfiction, is as with a novel, you want the reader to get so into the story that they can see themselves through these people, that you can almost think to yourself, what would I have done had I been in the place that these people were in?
Well, and you have a penultimate scene in there where the doctor is traveling across country, and he has to go drive for days because he knows he can't stop and find a hotel that will take him in. And even when he thinks he's finally to a safe spot, he isn't. And as you read it, you're kind of going, I mean, obviously he's alive because you interviewed him, but you're wondering how it all turns out, and then that's, as you say, that's kind of the arc, or the narrative arc that you want to
creating that suspense. Creating that sense of wonderment and anxiety, actually, that he experienced, to try to recreate that.
And you replicated that ride, didn't you?
I did.
That drive.
I rented a Buick, as he had. He had a Buick Roadmaster, which he was very proud of. He said that it rode like a chariot, and that if you'd seen it, you would have wanted it to. So he was quite the character. And I rented a Buick, and I had my parents in the car with me, who, as I mentioned, were part of this migration as well. And I wanted to experience what it was like so that I could write about it, so that the reader could experience it as well. And we got to a point where the road got quite jagged through the mountains, as one knows quite well here. And it was darkness because he'd been driving all that time. It was now nighttime, and he hadn't been able to find a place. And so I was following the same path. And it was getting to be so late, and I was so tired. I was just weary and exhausted. Almost your eyes began to ache from all the pain, just the sleeplessness. And I began to veer from the road, and my parents were really nervous for us. They were so worried. And they said, you just have to stop the car. You just have to stop the car. And they said, if you won't stop the car, let us out, because this is just too dangerous. And so we were near Yuma, Arizona, and because there had been, and this was many, many decades after his experience, and there was no, and the country's changed so much since then, we had no trouble finding a place. But it actually made me feel even more empathy for him and for all the people who couldn't do this. This was not only about the migration, it was about what life was like for any person who was African American during that time.
Well, one of the things that was striking to me, although I have to say I saw it a bit growing up, was something called the Northern Paradox. It also existed in the West.
Yeah.
The doctor experienced this, and that was, yeah, we're not for all that Jim Crow stuff and discrimination on the surface. But down below, I mean, one of your characters had a drink at a bar, and the bartender took the glass and smashed it on the ground afterwards.
That same thing, yeah, George.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of examples in your book about how hard it was after the migration.
How all these people were flooding into the cities from all over the world and from the southern part of the United States. And because it was such a competitive world and a forbidding, anonymous, frightening world actually for someone coming in from the countryside to these big cities, they were pitted against one another. And as I said, we're still living with the after effects of that. But because of that, there was resistance to the arrival of these people, even in the northern states and the western states that were putatively free. And they called that resistance James Crow, as opposed to Jim Crow. And that was what met Dr. Foster as he was making his way out. That's what met George Starling when he went just to a bar to get a drink, and the bartender made a show of smashing the glass after he and his friend had set their glasses down, because it wasn't fit now for anyone else to drink from.
And women were given voice tests, or told that they had to have a high school diploma or college degree
Yes.
to get a job. All sorts of little ways to keep from
There were also
hiring.
bigger ways as well. The restrictive covenants that made it difficult, if not impossible, for African Americans to move outside of the sections of these cities that they had been consigned to. Even if they had saved up their money, they had the down payment, they still met with such tremendous resistance that they were not able to actually move out.
And some of the toughest critics to the migrants were other African Americans themselves. I copied a page from your book, from the chapter called "The Kinder Mistress," which refers to the North, and the Chicago Defender, which was a paper that covered these issues, ran lists of do's and don'ts for the individuals who had migrated. Things like, don't hang out the windows, don't wear handkerchiefs on your head, don't use vile language in public places, don't allow children to beg on the streets, don't appear on the street with old dust caps, dirty aprons, and ragged clothes. So this idea that these were hicks coming up and we need to tell them how to behave. But in fact, as your book points out, many of the migrants or immigrants had equal amounts, if not more, of education and two-parent households.
Well, yes, in fact, there was a great diversity among the people who had come up north during that time. And remember, I mean, obviously it went on for many decades, so you would have had a lot of variety of the people. But it turns out that a good number of them had actually come from the towns, small towns in the South, so they had had some exposure to, even though they didn't have a lot of money, they had a little bit of exposure to what town life would be like. But then, of course, there were people who had come from the countryside, as I said. They were from the plantation. They had been sharecroppers, and they simply did not have access to the kind of clothing that citified people, sophisticates, had. And so they were a source of some embarrassment to the people who had preceded them, which I think is also a reminder of how similar this was to almost any migration or immigration experience. Sometimes with any immigration experience, the people who are most worried, the most resistant, the most sensitive to how everyone's being perceived are those who got there before them and don't want the status of all of them to be in peril, to be threatened, because newcomers are arriving and may be sort of bringing the whole group some embarrassment by not having made the adjustment yet.
So people in the South at first were, let them go.
Yeah.
But then there became kind of this panic as They realized their workforce was leaving. Even a newspaper said, we must have the Negro in the South. It's the most pressing thing before the state today. They even sent delegations of people to the North saying, come back, we'll pay you more and your conditions will be better, we'll put down the whip or whatever it is. I mean, I'm not trying to make, I mean, it's
no,
just,
but that's actually what they did.
They tried to lure them back, cajole them back. Didn't really work.
No, it didn't. They actually sent delegations, as you said, from the various plantations to where their former sharecroppers had, where they were now living, and attempted to persuade them to come back. Delegations went to the North to try to get them to come back. They did everything they could ultimately to try to keep them from going, but there was nothing they could do. I mean, again, they were free American citizens, which was probably part of the challenge to begin with. They were not seen as free until they made themselves free.
There's a reverse migration of sorts happening now. People are moving back to the South, including you. You live in Atlanta now with your mother. Why do you think that's happening or has happened?
Well, when it comes to me, I actually went there to work to finish this book because I needed to be in the South. I really needed to know what it was like to live there. I'd spent my entire life in the North, in big cities in the North. And most recently, before going there, I was in Chicago, and I was hearing all these stories, essentially expatriate stories, the stories of people who had lived there, left, and some of them still had a tremendous sense of, bitterness, longing, homesickness, heart sickness, all of those things that happen when you're an expatriate. And I needed to see it for myself, so that's how I ended up there. When it comes to what's called the reverse migration, which I actually call the return migration, I sort of feel that when you say something is reverse, it sounds as if the original thing was not the right thing, or that you're turning back, or that somehow you're going backward. And I don't think any migration is a reversal. I think it's always something that people do for purpose and for a reason, and that something important is going to come out of it. In this case, the interesting thing about the return migration is that it is a product of the Great Migration as well. And that's because this, this flood of people left, the parents and grandparents of the people who are there now, it forced the South to change. That in combination, obviously, with the 6 million people who put pressure on the South by leaving, those who stayed and fought the final battle, which we know as civil rights movement, together put so much pressure on the South that it ultimately changed. And so this return migration means that it's a more welcoming place for people of all backgrounds.
2014 is the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act, July 2nd. How do you sense that we stand right now? Because as you say, there have been leaps and bounds. The grandson of one of your characters had to turn down several Ivy League schools to go to another Ivy League school. I mean, so the grandfather got to know about that, to see that, and the changes you just mentioned. Other people are saying, there's still racial profiling. We have a Supreme Court case regarding the Voting Rights Act in the South.
Mass incarceration.
So
great inequities in, economically still. Job prospects, unemployment. Almost every index there are great disparities that we live with still to this day as a country. One of the things that is a reminder to me is that this is merely 50 years in a long arc of our country's history. That's really not a very long time, particularly, and also when you think about the long arc of human history, when you look at older parts of the world, as in Europe and other parts of the world, it's really an eye blink. And so this whole idea of freedom, of equality, of inclusion is really quite new in our country. And so we've come a very long way in a fairly short period of time. And in fact, because of how far we've come, I think people often forget why we came here to begin with. Why was there this need for the Civil Rights Act? Why was there this need to actually create a law that would open up the way for all kinds of people?
Your protagonist, unfortunately, did not live to see the publication of this book. I assume that is a sadness for you on one hand, but also there's a sense of relief that you did tell their stories.
Well, the thing is, it was a race against the clock to find them to begin with. And I knew that this was a generation, or these were generations actually, that were getting up in years. And I wanted to get to them before it was too late, because once they were gone, there would be no one to tell the story from a first-hand perspective, someone who'd actually lived it. So I'm just so very grateful I was able to reach them. I'm so grateful that they opened up their hearts and their memories for all of us to learn from.
Do you think it would have even been in the realm of possibility in their minds that we would have an African American president? Do you think they saw that on the horizon? You know, would they have been surprised, or?
I don't think they could have imagined it. I don't think they could have imagined it. I think they would have wanted it and they would have hoped for it, but I don't think that they would have believed it until they saw it for themselves, and they didn't get a chance to. And they would have been overjoyed at the idea of it.
I know President Obama had this book on his reading list.
Yes.
Back in 2011. Did he ever contact you about having read it?
Yes, I did get a letter from him, and it was, you know, that's an out-of-body experience as well. One of many, many things that has happened in the last 4 years that I could never, ever have imagined. Just simply couldn't have.
Perhaps not fair to ask you how this has changed your life, but I will.
Yeah. Well, it just means that I have spent almost, you know, my entire life has turned around to focus in on this and this alone. And I could not have imagined that I would be 4 years out still talking about what essentially is a history book. It's a work of history. I never could have foreseen that I would have been interacting with so many people for whom this was not their direct story, their own story, but who see themselves in these people. I hear all kinds of stories everywhere I go. And it's that potential for connection, that potential for being able to see oneself in the lives and the stories of people who on the face of it are very different from you, but then seeing that connection and seeing yourself in them was what I had hoped for all along. And then to see that play out, you know, from Amsterdam in the Netherlands to Anchorage in Alaska is just such a gift. It's just been a miracle and just so wonderful.
And I know there was some talk of this being a TV series. Is that still?
Yes, there is very much the potential for it becoming a miniseries. I don't have anything to say concretely, but it looks really, really promising, and I'm really happy. I'm happy that all of this has proceeded in a beautifully absorbing way. In other words, I've been able to absorb these things. I think I would have been so overwhelmed if everything happened on the same day, but it's just beautifully made its way through the world. This book has. It's just made its way through the world at its own pace and in its own time, kind of like the migration itself.
I was going to say, kind of like a river or a journey itself.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing part of that journey with me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to author Isabel Wilkerson discussing her book, The Warmth of Other Suns. To learn more or to watch this interview again, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.